Hi students, I'm happy to be sitting here ready to give a lecture to you on Chapter 8 for our Psychology of Exceptionality class. From time to time I might get up just to make sure that the camera has not cycled off. Sometimes it will do that and I'll find myself having done 15 minutes of a lecture and realize that the camera turned off. So that I probably every few minutes will get up, or every 10 minutes maybe get up and just make sure the camera's running. So this is a cool chapter on communication disorders, speech and language disorders that children have. We will talk about the generalities of that. I won't expect you to know minute details of this, but this is a great chapter. It's an area of special education that involves about 21% of children who receive special education, are receiving special education for speech and language. And the estimates for how many children have this kind of disorder are about 2.5% for the general population. But the book sort of suggests that these numbers are probably not very accurate because different school districts, different states might define speech and language or communication disorders in different ways. And so it is thought that probably these numbers are a little underreported. Well, let's talk about the early notes. I guess I have been doing that really, just a general overview and introduction to you for what this chapter is about. We're going to talk a little bit about what communication is, sort of breaking that down into the pieces of what it is so that we can then understand where it is that children have difficulty and need assistance. So communication, just communication, is broken down into 3 elements. And I remember this is even a topic area that was in our Intro to Human Services book a long time ago, last year, when you would have taken that class. So communication, as I started to say, is broken into 3 elements. There's a message that exists, and there's a person who's sending a message, and there's a person who receives a message. And those 3 elements sort of define what communication is. Also, this can involve intra-communication, and intra means inside, not between 2 people or two organizations or something. So intra-communication is where we talk to ourselves or we write notes to ourselves, and so we're kind of communicating to ourselves and forming thoughts and writing thoughts down. That's interesting to think about too if a child has difficulty with communication. It does serve a lot of functions for us. Obviously, we are very communicative organisms, human beings are. So one of those functions is narrating, being able to tell a story in a sequence and follow a story in a sequence. That's an aspect of communication. Another one is explaining or informing, being able to interpret information that we get and understanding that. So learning for you and for me uses this element of explaining and informing. Requesting is another piece of this, being able to ask for what we want clearly enough so that people can understand what it is we're asking for. And a lot of kids who are young children who have difficulty with a lag in their communication skills sometimes can become hitters or biters because they're trying to say something or express something, but they don't really have good language development yet to say what it is they want. And once those children, get better language skills, and teachers say use your words to them all the time instead of hitting or biting somebody or snatching something. Once kids, are able to move along with their language development, they don't typically use those behaviors anymore, but those are behaviors of frustration for not being able to ask or request what they want. The 4th area that I want to talk about that communication involves is expressing. So being able to tell things that we feel, tell our opinions, tell our feelings, tell what's happened. So, when you think about it, a child who has no speech ability, that's a frustrating position for the child to be in. And usually a child can use facial expressions or gestures Often kids who have language delays, their parents are taught to use a little bit of sign language with them so that they can communicate and express what it is that they are feeling or they need. So these are all kind of non-linguistic actions if a child isn't using language yet. Speech is a code for communicating or a set of rules. This is, let's talk about language, defining language, Roman numeral 2 on our lecture outline. So it's a code for communicating. It's a set of rules that a culture agrees upon. It's not static. Language does change over time. Usage of language changes over time. So, language of our great-great-grandparents is a little bit different from the language that's used today. So there are 5 dimensions of language, and I want to talk about those, but not really make you required to know them all. I'm just going to check the camera too, but I'll keep talking. The first element of language is phonology, or phonemes. And remember, these are the very basic speech sounds that we make, just the tiniest sound that's a piece of a word, phonology. So an example that your book gives is B, the B sound in bear is a phoneme or a piece of phonology. You might remember sounding out words when you were a child. And so you would sound out the B, and then you would sound out the EA, that's kind of hard, and the R sound usually children get. And often when kids are using, phonology or phonics to sound out words and learn to read, they can they sort of work on the first part of the word, and then they can often get the last part of the word. And then they kind of figure it out by filling in the gap in the middle part of the word. So phonology is those tiny little pieces. Then morphemes are a language's basic unit of meaning and how these meanings combine into words. Syntax is another aspect of language. It's essentially the grammar rules that we use, how we put a subject and a verb and an adjective into a sentence. I think about this sometimes when I'm writing an email and I'm trying to be quick, and when I reread it, sometimes I've left out a subject or some other small piece of syntax that really is important. So I'll go back and fill that in and make that a more complete sentence. Semantics is another aspect we want to look at. This is the meaning of words and combinations of words. Often understanding the meaning of what somebody says is due to its context in a sentence. And then lastly, pragmatics is the last of these 5 dimensions of language. And this is the social use of language. And if you look on page, I have 259, I'm just flipping my book over to look at pragmatics. This is at the bottom in bold of this page. It talks about this being how the social use of language is constructed. And so we use language for different purposes. We might use language to say hello, or to demand something, or to request something, or promise somebody something. And so this would be the idea of pragmatics of language. We should talk about the idea of dialects. And you probably know what the word dialect means, but it essentially refers to us having a certain way that our speech sounds. And so in the United States, it is thought that there are probably 10 different dialects. And if you think about how someone from Louisiana sounds versus somebody maybe from California, and then come over to Boston, that heavy Boston accent, those would all be referred to as dialects. They're English, but they have pronunciation and articulations that are different, even pacing actually, that make those things a dialect. And so these, dialects are conventions that we use, and we learn them because we grow up in a certain place and in a certain kind of family, and this is how our family talks. Some of the ideas about dialect can be more than just regional. It can be the way that a family talks in terms of their socioeconomic group, how educated they are, and how much different vocabulary they use. And so it's important for you to understand that, within our communication system, we have dialects. All right, moving on to Roman numeral 3, the idea that speech, and looking at the process of how speech is created. And here I think we're looking a little bit more at, the physical nature of how speech comes out of us, how we produce it. And so speech is the oral production of language. And if you think about sign language is the visual production of language, right? But here we're talking about the oral production of language, which is speech. And so this also, by the way, oral language is supposed to be the most efficient, or thought to be the most efficient way to communicate, by using words and sounds. There are 4 different processes associated with speech. I'm just going to call them out to you, and we can talk about them a little bit, but these are described in more detail on page 261. So respiration is a piece of speech. When you think about how as you're talking, you use your breath to, you take a breath before you can get more sounds out. Some people, have a real breathy way of speaking, and that actually, if it's more severe, can be a type of speech impairment. But respiration, the using of our breath to make sounds come out. Then phonation, remember we talked about these very small elemental pieces of a language sound. Phonation is one of the 4. Then resonation has to do with the vocal quality that you produce. So some of you may have a very deep vocal quality. Other people might have higher vocal quality. My students always tell me that I have such a soft voice, and I think that refers to what we mean by resonation. It's funny, I don't think that I have a soft voice, but people tell me I do, and that would be an aspect of my resonation. And then the last piece is articulation. How specifically we say speech sounds. Some of us slur our speech sounds and our sentences together. Probably when you think about people who are newscasters, articulation, or actors, probably, articulation would be a very important concern to them. So that's on page 261 if you want to look at that. There's a really interesting paragraph on page 261 also that has to do with articulation, and it has to do with pronouncing one word, a 3-syllable word, statistics. And if you read that paragraph and really think about it, it's giving us an idea of all the many actions that our mouth must make to clearly pronounce that word, statistics. What does your tongue have to do? What does the shape of your tongue have to do? Where does your tongue have to be in your mouth? How much air needs to come through to make the s sound and the t sound? And that's just a really great example of articulation and speech process. I would ask you to just read that over carefully to yourself again. So typical speech and language development is something that we know quite a bit about now. I'm just going to check the camera again, make sure it's running. But if you look on page, let me see what it is, page 262 and 263, you'll see a figure that shows how kids develop language and at what age they do it. And so when a child's a baby, they make certain kinds of sounds as they develop language. A simple way to understand this is crying sounds, or sounds of distress that babies make. They are said to really start to learn to cry in different ways depending on how urgent their need is. So I can see this clearly with a baby who's very, very hungry and just wants to eat. Excuse me, maybe you're in the car and you didn't get a chance to give your baby a bottle before you left, and they start to cry and they get increasingly distressed in the car because they want you to stop and feed them. They don't know they want you to stop. They just want you to feed them. That's a different kind of crying sound than a child who is just sort of irritated because somebody's, maybe something's itchy on their body, or maybe they're tired. A baby who's tired makes, to me, a different kind of a sound. Well, that's just one part of the development of language, the most elemental and beginning parts of the development of language. And this chart, this figure on page 262 and 263, it shows from birth to age 5 what would be typical language development. And this is important for us to think about because, in the early years of a child's life, those are the times when we're hopeful that children are developing strong language and that their language is coming along. And, teachers in preschool, teachers in daycare centers, elementary teachers, kindergarten teachers for sure, are going to concern themselves with how children are able to develop language, and do they see a difference? Is there a lag in the way that a child's using language in certain ways? And this is where, teachers will perhaps suggest that a child be evaluated for a speech or language disorder. So this is kind of interesting. I learned a lot about this actually when I was in undergraduate school. I had a minor in preschool education, and it was really important for us to understand what happened in the first 5 years of life, what physical development looks like, but what language development should look like also. So pay attention to that. There's an interesting study that's mentioned in the text that is on pages 261, and then it kind of wraps over onto page 263, and it's called the Hart and Risley study. And in your book, they describe this as a landmark study, and I think about landmark studies as being studies that really give a whole new view of a certain part of knowledge. And so this study was done, published in 1995, so went on for, I think, 2.5 years. So maybe this whole thing really happened in about 3 to 3.5 years when you think about people gathering data and then analyzing data and then writing it up and publishing it. Anyway, it was a study of 42 families, very diverse in region, in their socioeconomic status and their financial situation, educational levels, and so on. And what happened was that researchers went out and they listened to families talk for 1 hour every month. And they did this for 2.5 years. And then they came back and they analyzed how many words were used, how long were the sentences, how long were the paragraphs, how do various people communicate within their families. The interesting thing that was found here was that there was a 30 million word discrepancy. I'm going to say that again because it blows my mind. A 30 million word discrepancy between families who had maybe higher financial status or educational status and families who had lower means. So I think this is super interesting. You can certainly have not much money or means, but be an educated person and be a person who reads books and uses sentences and uses complex sentences. Just as well as if you are a wealthy person and you use complex sentences and have a higher sort of level of communicating, mainly by using more descriptive and exact words for things. Interestingly, not to be political at all, you know me, I don't want to be all up in that, but interestingly, I think our president has a very, very, very limited vocabulary and a limited way of speaking. And we talk about this in our culture quite a bit, actually. I don't know why this is. My husband and I talk about it all the time. Whether it's just that he's a businessman and he's used to being very direct and saying things fast and expecting things to happen fast, or if it is just a manner of his speaking. I don't think it has to do with, his upbringing. And as I understand it, he was raised in an upbringing with, plenty of means. But the Hart and Risley study is important to educators because it really pointed out that there are very vast differences between the vocabulary levels of kids who come to our schools. And actually there's a philanthropic project that exists to try to raise the bridge the word gap is what it's called, and I'm going to look that up. I'm really curious about that project, the Bridge the Word Gap project. It's a national research network mission. So I'm going to look that up in the book. That makes me very curious about things. All right, I'm going to take a break and break this film up. I'm going to stop. We're at lecture outline section 5, and then I'm going to post this lecture for you and then try to get the second half of this lecture up.